I wasn't looking for anything in that park. I just wanted to stop thinking for an hour. But she sat down next to me, and somehow everything I tried to silence began to speak louder. It wasn't what she said. It was the way she stayed quiet, as if her silence knew exactly where to find me. Before she stood up, she looked at me once. Just once. And I knew, before I understood what it meant, that afternoon had changed something I didn't know could be changed. If you've ever sat quietly next to someone and felt that the silence was dangerous, you're in the right place. Subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you hearing this from right now? It was an October afternoon, the kind of afternoon that seems to know you need to breathe, not dramatically. Not with that cinematic wind that blows your hair around and makes you look like something out of a movie. It was just cold enough for the air to sting slightly in your nose. And the sky was that soft gray shade that makes everything look the same, as if the world had turned down the volume. I had left home without a purpose. That needs to be clear. I wasn't going anywhere. I had no mission, no podcast listening, no to-do list while walking. I just had that specific kind of tiredness that isn't from work or bad sleep. It's the tiredness of being yourself for too long without any breaks. The park was 3 blocks from my apartment. One of those small urban parks that American cities scatter around as an excuse for not having more trees anywhere else. A fountain in the middle that didn't work in the winter. A few dogs being pulled by leashes. 1 or 2 mothers with strollers. The dark wooden bench that I always ignored because it was somewhat shady, but that day it was exactly what I wanted, a place slightly hidden from the rest. I sat down with my coat buttoned up to my chin and just stared into space. I had coffee in a thermos in my pocket. I took a sip. It was too lukewarm to be good, and too cold to be bad. That middle ground that sometimes is all you can get. And I started thinking not about anything specific. That kind of thought that has no form, that circulates without settling anywhere. Sometimes the mind does that. It goes into standby mode. It doesn't rest, but it also doesn't produce anything. It just exists, in that intermediate state that you learn to tolerate when none of the clearer states are available. The park had just the right amount of noise. Distant enough not to disturb. Present enough so that I wouldn't feel completely alone. And then I heard footsteps. I'm not saying I paid attention to them. I didn't. The bench was long. There was space. It was perfectly reasonable for someone to sit down. What I can't explain, and probably won't be able to at any point in this story, is why, when she sat down, the air in the entire park seemed to change temperature, just 1 degree. Maybe less, but I felt it. She didn't say anything. That was the first thing I noticed, not as relief, not as strangeness. Just as a fact. She sat down, adjusted something in the bag that was on her lap, and looked ahead. Just like me. I didn't turn to look. That also needs to be clear. I kept my gaze fixed on the dry fountain, the warm glass in my hands, doing exactly what I had been doing before. But some part of me, the part that operates before conscious thought, had registered her presence with an attention that wasn't chosen. It smelled faintly of something that took me a while to identify. Coffee too, but different from mine, stronger, without milk. And something else underneath. Wood or cedar or something I associate with old houses that have books on every wall. That's how I am with smells. They come before anything else. She was wearing a coat that was longer than mine, a dark moss color. Her hair was also dark, with strands of white that she didn't hide, and there was something about that choice that I perceived without naming it, like information that the body files away before the mind decides what to do with it. My estimate was that she was in her early 40s. But it wasn't a thought, it was just a quick, fleeting impression, like when you calculate distance without realizing you've done it. The park remained unchanged. The puppies were still being led by their leashes. The wind was still blowing intermittently. A seagull landed near the fountain, which was strange, because there was no water, But seagulls have their own logic. And the two of us stayed there. In silence. But it was a different kind of silence than I had before she arrived. The silence before was empty. The kind of silence you inhabit when you have no one to take a stand against you. The silence now had weight. It had direction. It was the silence of two bodies that know of each other without having introduced themselves. She sighed. Not from sadness. Not from weariness. It was the sigh of someone who had finally stopped. The same reason I had come, I realized. There was something recognizable in that sound. Like hearing someone speak your language in a foreign city. It doesn't mean you know each other. It just means something is shared. I looked at my cup, and I didn't think anything. But my heart was beating slightly differently, and I didn't do anything about it. The seagull had flown away. A small child walked by with a chick that was almost as big as she was. A tree on the other side of the park shed leaves at irregular intervals, as if it were thinking about each one before letting it go. Everything's normal. Everything's completely normal. Except that I was hyper-aware of every millimeter of space between me and that woman on the bench. It wasn't much. The bench was long, but not immense. There were perhaps 60 centimeters between where my thigh ended and where hers began. 60 centimeters of cold wood in October air. A perfectly reasonable distance between two strangers in a public park. And yet I could still feel the warmth of her body at that distance. Or I thought I could. That's the problem. When the body starts inventing data, you can no longer audit what is real and what is a desire for perception. Or a fear of perception. Sometimes they are the same thing. My breathing was slightly altered. Not visibly, I'm sure it wasn't visibly, but internally. Like when you're in a small elevator with someone and you do that automatic calibration of how much air you occupy. She moved. Just to get something out of her bag. A tissue. She blew her nose with the specific delicacy of someone trying to be discreet in public, then held the folded tissue in her hand for a moment before putting it away. A completely mundane gesture. But I noticed the shape of her hands. The long fingers. A simple ring on her right index finger, not a wedding ring, just a ring. The thumbnail was slightly different from the others, as if it had broken and grown back recently. I noticed all of that in less than 3 seconds. And then I looked back ahead and wondered when exactly my attention had become this kind of camera capturing details of someone. I didn't know, who hadn't said anything to me, who was simply existing beside me on a cold afternoon. My mouth was slightly dry. I took another sip of coffee. Still too lukewarm. I remember the tone though, without urgency, like someone thinking aloud rather than starting a conversation. Like someone who wasn't necessarily expecting an answer. I replied. I also don't remember exactly what. I probably agreed. Because I did agree. That year's autumn had something, a specific quality of light that I had noticed since the beginning of the month but hadn't spoken to anyone about because there was no one to talk to about it. And she nodded. And we were quiet again. But this time the silence was different. It had been opened. It was the silence that comes after a sentence, not before, and it has a completely different texture. Like a room that has been ventilated. The same space, the same air, but something circulated. She asked if I lived nearby. I said yes. 3 blocks. She said she had moved to the neighborhood 4 months ago. That she was still learning the geometry of the place. Which streets had good sidewalks. Where the pharmacies were. Which cafes opened early enough for those who wake up before they want to. I knew exactly which coffee it was. And when I said her name, she turned to me for the first time. Not completely. A turn of maybe 30 degrees, enough for me to see the angle of her face from the front. Her eyes were a color I couldn't immediately name. Somewhere between brown and green, depending on where the gray October light hit. She smiled. Not with her teeth, just with the corners of her mouth and something in her eyes that wasn't exactly joy, but was adjacent to it. I knew it had to be this one, she said. And I smiled back. And for a moment the whole park became slightly quieter, like when the volume of a room decreases in a way you only notice later. One of those pleasant coincidences of urban life where you briefly meet someone with whom the conversation flows and then each goes their own way and the world seems slightly more habitable than it was before. I tried to file it this way. But there was resistance in the archive. You know when you try to put something in a drawer and the drawer doesn't close properly? It's not because the object is too big. It's just that something is misaligned. At the wrong angle, and no matter how much you push, there's still a gap. That's how it was. I made dinner. I cleaned the kitchen. I watched 20 minutes of something on television without registering anything that was happening. I went to brush my teeth looking in the mirror with that deep, unfocused gaze, and I realized I was thinking about her hands. Not in an elaborate way, just her hands. Her long fingers. The ring on her index finger. The way she held her purse in her lap as if she were used to having things to keep. I know what that is. This is the part where I need to say that I know what this is. It's not confusion. It's not generic admiration. It's not the kind of attention you pay to any interesting person who comes along. It's something else entirely. But I let the night pass without naming it. Sometimes naming is a kind of summoning, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to summon what lay on the other side of that name. I went to bed earlier than usual. I stayed up longer than I should have. And the last thing that crossed my mind before falling asleep wasn't an image of her. It wasn't a phrase she said. It was the space. The 60 centimeters between us on the bench. And how I had spent the entire afternoon hyper-aware of that space without ever moving towards it. Nor move away. After a second, the time it takes for someone to sense that the space has changed before confirming why. Our eyes met. And we both remained completely quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, and less than I realized at the time. She nodded slightly. That specific nod of acknowledgement, nod of enthusiasm, nod of performative surprise. Just that, I know you're here, and that's not irrelevant. I smiled. I ordered the coffee. I stood waiting near the counter. My attention completely divided between not looking like I was looking at her and trying to understand why my pulse had quickened. When my name was called, I picked up the cup. And I went to sit at the table next to hers. I don't know why. There were other tables. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was the kind of movement the body makes before the mind votes. She looked up when I approached. "October is haunting you," she said. It wasn't a joke. It was said with that gentle seriousness some people have, where the humor is there but doesn't need to be signaled. I said it was possible. Or that I was chasing October. That sometimes it was hard to know who was following whom. She looked at me for a second longer than the sentence required. And then he opened the book again. We sat at separate tables for perhaps 40 minutes. We didn't speak for most of that time. Once or twice a comment, about the sound of a cup falling, about a song that played for 2 seconds before changing. Small openings that neither of us forced into conversation. But there was something in those 40 minutes that wasn't in the previous 40 minutes of my morning. A conscience. From both sides I'm sure of it, though I can't prove it. When someone is aware of you, you feel it. It's not magic. It's just the body doing what bodies do when someone is paying attention, and, you know. Anne says nothing. She needed something simple, a plug adapter. One of those you always have lying around in a drawer and never know which one it's in. I said I probably had one. The search took longer than it should have because my apartment is the kind of place where things exist, but don't have a fixed address. She stood in the kitchen doorway while I rummaged through drawers. We talked about unimportant things. The rain on the window. The smell of a damp apartment. A book she saw on the living room shelf and asked if I liked it. I found the adapter. I turned to give it to her, and she was closer than I expected. She hadn't moved. I was the one who had come toward her without calculating the distance. We stood still. The adapter in my hands, the rain outside, the apartment quiet in a way that apartments only become when the outside world is noisy enough to create an envelope of privacy. And she said my name, just my name. Nothing else. The way you say someone's name when what you really mean is something else entirely. But the name is the only sound that feels safe to utter. I stood still. There was a phrase that I felt formed in my own chest. I can't reproduce it now because I never let it out, but it was there complete with a beginning, middle, and end just waiting to be spoken. And then her phone vibrated. She lowered her gaze. She read something. She made that expression of someone who remembers that there is an outside world with specific demands. I need to go, she said. Normal tone. Almost normal. He picked up the adapter. He thanked them. He left. I closed the door. And I stood there in the kitchen, listening to the sound of the rain, that phrase still stuck in my chest, with nowhere to go. With no one to receive her. That's important to say because it sounds like an escape, and I don't want it to sound like something it wasn't. It had been planned for weeks. Ticket bought. My sister was waiting. A completely normal visit between two sisters who hadn't seen each other since the summer. But the timing was what it was. I packed my bags the night before, methodically. That drawer-by-drawer organization I can only manage when I'm trying not to think about something. I folded the shirts with excessive attention to detail that didn't matter. I checked the Portland weather forecast 4 times, as if the weather would change between checks. I didn't text her before I left. There was no practical reason to send it. We didn't exchange messages regularly yet. We were recent neighbors who occasionally had coffee together. There was no established protocol for travel notifications. But I knew, the moment I packed my bags, that the absence of a message was also a choice. Portland was cold and smelled of pine and the light smoke of someone warming the house by the fireplace. My sister picked me up at the airport wearing a very large coat, and with that energy of hers, like someone who's trying to do 3 things at once, but still truly listens to you. We stayed for 4 days. We went to a farmer's market one Saturday morning. We hiked a short trail she knew. We cooked together twice. We watched a movie that neither of us would have chosen on our own, and we loved it for different reasons. Those were 4 good days. But there was a background noise that I carried with me. Not loud. Not persistent. Just present, that quality of something unfinished that doesn't let you be completely anywhere, because a part of you is in a place you can't name. On the 3rd day, my sister asked me what was going on. I said I was fine. She looked at me the way sisters look at you when they know you're lying but understand you need to lie a little longer. And he changed the subject. On the flight back, I looked up at the clouds and thought about the power adapter. In the name mentioned without further explanation. And in the silence after the door is closed, the more you try not to think, the more solid the thought becomes. The more space it occupies, the more it appears in blank spaces on the margins of the other things you're trying to do. It works sometimes through saturation. You think until you're tired of it, but there's a cost. I returned from Portland on a Tuesday. I went to the supermarket. I cleaned the apartment with that specific energy of returning from a short trip. Everything seems slightly out of place in your own home, and tidying up is a way of reclaiming the space. I didn't run into her. For 4 days, I didn't run into her anywhere. I avoided the park consciously. I went to the cafe once, early in the morning, and she wasn't there. I walked down the hallway of our building with that peripheral awareness of someone who doesn't want to be caught looking. And yet she still showed up, not in grand memories. In fragments. The quality of the afternoon light in the park that first October, the smell of cedar and strong coffee. The ring on her right index finger. The way she said my name with a period where there should have been a comma. Fragments that didn't ask for permission. They appeared while I waited for the coffee to brew. While I was reading something completely unrelated. While I woke up in the morning in that half-sleep state where the boundaries between what you thought and what you dreamed aren't very clear. There's something no one talks about regarding absence, that it's not neutral. Absence has texture. The absence of a specific person has that person's taste, that person's smell, that hole in their exact shape. And I would lie awake staring at the ceiling of my room, thinking that it didn't make sense. That it was someone I had met less than 2 months ago. That we had exchanged only a few hours, a few sentences. That there was a very clear line between what actually existed and what I was building in the space between our encounters. But the body doesn't do well with limits. The body is good with details, and I had memorized too many details. Without realizing he was keeping it. It was the exhaustion of carrying something without being able to put it down. That state where you're not exactly suffering, but you're not free either. And the difference between the two starts to weigh on you in ways you didn't expect. I started walking more. Unplanned, I only realized I was doing it when I first realized I was doing it. I was leaving the apartment without a destination more often than before. As if the movement helped distribute the weight somehow. As if the steps were a way of not getting too stuck in any one thought. One Wednesday afternoon in November, when it was getting colder, I walked through the park with no intention of sitting down. But there was a low fog that day. The kind of fog that softens the edges of things, that makes the branches of trees look like charcoal drawings against the white sky. And there was something about that quality of light that made me stop. I sat on the same bench. Not because I was expecting it. Just because the place held a memory that I didn't yet know what to do with. I stayed for about 20 minutes. Nobody came. I left with that specific feeling you get when you didn't know you were expecting something. Until its absence shows you that you were. But the next day, a message arrived. A simple message. Asking if I'd returned from my trip safely. She didn't know about Portland. Someone from the building had probably mentioned it. It didn't matter how she knew. What mattered was that I had asked. I held the phone in my hand longer than the response required. Rereading those 2 sentences as if there were more than 2 sentences. Searching for what? Temperature. Intention. Some sign that this message carried the same weight I was carrying. I don't know if I found it. I replied that I had returned safely. That Portland smelled of winter, but in a good way. She took a while. Then she replied that she wanted to hear about it. My heart did something, which I will not attempt to describe. I sat down. I ordered my usual coffee. And for about 10 minutes we talked about side issues, Portland, the neighborhood, a construction project that had started on her street. The kind of conversation that exists to fill the space while both parties gauge what's available. And then she said, I kept thinking about what happened in your apartment. He didn't elaborate. He just said that. And he looked at me with a calmness that I knew in that instant, without a doubt, was the calmness of someone who had also lost sleep and arrived on the other side with less urgency but no less certainty. I could have said that I didn't know what she was talking about. I didn't say. He could have said something light, something that would reduce the weight of that moment to something manageable. I didn't say that either. I know. That's all. 2 monosyllables that weighed more than anything I could have articulated with more words. She nodded. There was a pause that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of pause that happens when 2 people are arriving at the same place by different routes and need a moment to confirm that they've arrived. I don't know what to do with this. She said it. And there was honesty in that sentence that I recognized because I was carrying the same weight. It wasn't refusal. It wasn't disguised fear. It was just truth. The admission that some things arrive before the map. Neither. I said. And we looked at each other for as long as it took for things to settle. The coffee has cooled down a bit. The light through the window shifted slightly. That November shift where the afternoon arrives without much warning. And none of us stood up. It was night about 2 weeks after the coffee. We had walked to a higher point in the neighborhood where we could see the city below. Not in an impressive way, not with that postcard skyline. Just lights from windows. Distant cars. The quiet geometry of a city that had already retreated into itself, into the cold of the night. We were standing on the side of a street that ended at a viewpoint. Her hands were in the pockets of her dark moss-colored coat, the same one from the first day. I noticed, unable to help but notice. We stayed like that for a while, without speaking. Not because there was nothing to say, there was plenty, perhaps more than any conversation could contain. But because the silence of that night was of a different kind from all the other silences we had shared. It was a silence of arrival. She turned slightly towards me. And without saying anything, without announcing anything, he simply placed his hand, the hand with the ring on his index finger, on my forearm. Outside my jacket, lightly, just the weight, and it stayed that way. I didn't move. She didn't say anything. And for a while that I can't measure because I wasn't measuring anything, we stayed like that, looking at the city, her hand on my arm, me with that heat seeping through the fabric of my coat, and reaching my skin as if fabric were no barrier at all. I don't know what that was. I know it wasn't the beginning. It wasn't the end. It was some point in the middle of something that doesn't yet have a full name, and perhaps doesn't need one yet. The wind came. She didn't take her hand away. I didn't move my arm away. And the city continued below us, indifferent and beautiful. And there was so much I could have said at that moment, and I said none. Because some things, when you keep them silent long enough, they begin to exist in a way that words could never achieve. If you've made it this far, you know what this afternoon was like. Give it a like if this stayed with you in some way you can't quite name yet. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe. There are more stories waiting. If this still resonates with you when you close your eyes tonight, the next video is about what happens when you finally say that thing you've been unable to say for months and the response isn't what you expected. But it's real. It's very real.